lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly toward that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is intentionally incomplete, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents. To learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Dialogues Across Differences project, which is funded by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, A New Divide, the Possibility for Dialogue. Additionally, this program is part of the Clark Forum's Leadership in an Age of Uncertainty series, which is supported by the Churchill Fund and its annual theme, Alternative Models. As an international student, this is my first time witnessing the atmosphere of an election year in person. Growing up in Thailand, a country that's experienced its fair share of political division, I've seen firsthand the effects of polarization. It has left me wondering about the antipathy and lack of communication between political parties back home and here in the United States. At Dickinson, I'm lucky to be surrounded by amazing young people who are ready to engage in a dialogue across political ideologies, and I'm excited to see what constructive conversations arise. Our speaker tonight, Manu Meel, is the CEO of BridgeUSA, one of the largest student movements empowering young people to have collaborative discourse. He has been featured in publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post for his work on bridging divides. In 2022, Meel was recognized as the Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, and additionally, Meel is the host of the podcast, The Hopeful Majority with Manu Meel, where he holds conversations with esteemed guests aimed at overcoming the current toxic political climate through curiosity, listening, and navigating differences. Previously, Meel has worked as an associate at the venture capital firm Amplo and at the Department of State as a political analyst in counterterrorism. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinions, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, note that accessible exits are located on the west side of this building, behind the projection screen. At this time, I ask that you silence all cell phones and electronic devices, and please join me in welcoming Manu Meel.
All right, now that I know where the exits are, I know where to escape. How's everybody doing? How are we doing? If the weather is any indication of how this talk is going to go, you're in for a long, long night. I'm sorry. For some reason, I cannot catch the sun. I've been on the road for the last 3 weeks. I was in D.C. last week. I'm in Pennsylvania this week, and I hear that you all are going to get sun on Thursday. And that's the day that I leave. And it seems that everywhere I attend, rain comes, and the moment I leave, the rain goes away. So with that, I hear that during this event, there's a conversation happening at the same time around a conversation on campus about demonstration policy. Is that right? Who knows what I'm talking about? So oftentimes when people talk about dialogue and conversation and civic engagement and listening and hearing people that are different than ourselves, I think that we oftentimes do not address some of the most difficult issues in our society. I think as I see some of the folks that were in the class that I was speaking with earlier today, We oftentimes think about civic dialogue, and yet the critique of this work is one that often correlates it to, y'all are going to have a bunch of dialogues and conversations, but can you actually resolve the hardest issues of our time? What happens when Israel-Palestine as a concept comes up? What happens when protest policies come up? Can we navigate issues like abortion? Manu, there's an election happening in 3 weeks. Are you going to talk about that? Because I think that a lot of people in our generation think about and hear civic dialogue, and honestly, I think a lot of us think it's a bunch of nonsense. Raise your hand if you've heard that before as a critique in the student body. All right, so I hit a nerve. I'm going to take you back to a day, February 2nd, 2017, the day that changed my life. I started off, y'all, as a pre-med student. I had no interest in any of this work. My mom's still confused. 2017, my goal was to be a doctor. As I don't know if any of y'all have Indian friends, but a son of 2 parents that immigrated to the United States, there's essentially 2 acceptable career paths. It's to be a doctor or an engineer. I decided to go the nonprofit route. Now, what happened was, on that day, February 2nd, 2017, I was walking back from my math seminar, and I distinctly remember helicopters overhead and protests in the distance. Now, this is UC Berkeley. That's par for the course. That's actually part of the student body. That's nothing new or different or special about that. The history of the student body is one of constant protest, constant moving forward, trying to push the bounds of our societal nature. But that day was a little different, because that day I walked past a cafe, and the cafe's window was broken in. And inside there was a TV screen. It said CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech. Now, this was before this notion of civic dialogue really became a thing on college campuses. This was before ideas like DEI and critical race theory and protests on college campuses and free speech were really mainstream. This was one of the first protests that changed the trajectory of, I think, what we hear on civic campuses and dialogues across the country. What was crazy about that moment, when I was watching that CNN screen, was that the television crew that was standing there, filming that, was standing right next to me. And that was sort of the breaking the fourth wall. That was a moment where it felt like I just went from being some random spectator to suddenly feeling like you're a participant. The next 3 hours, I walked through campus as a freshman that didn't know much, that was relatively confused, but really pained about one thing. And what I was pained about, and a question that I had, was what is causing our campus community to be in a moment where people are willing to leave class, where groups feel like they got to invite somebody, where people feel like they're at the knife's edge, and the ultimate conclusion of that moment is conflict and division. Why is that? That protest actually was the largest protest in Berkeley's history since the 60s, since Dr. King came to campus. Why do I share that story with you? Well, when Anthony had reached out to me as part of the Clark Forum, which I'm incredibly grateful for, to be invited and share the space with you, one of the things that we had discussed and talked about was we feel like we're at a moment where the people that we disagree with, we are often told or perceive them to be our enemies. It's different than just dialogue across lines of difference, that the people that we disagree with are fundamentally our enemies. So the next day, we walked on campus, and you could just see the pain in the student body. You could see people wanting to clean up the trash. There was challenge, students that had protested the event, students that had invited the speaker. Everybody was just figuring out a way to get along. You know, it's sort of that moment right after a giant family fight where you're like, all right, let's try to bring this back together. And so these dialogue circles started forming on campus. And I distinctly remember I was in a circle with a conversation with some people that are now some of my best friends. And we started to talk about the idea of what if we got, and now you're going to say, this guy's incredibly naive. What if we got the students that protested Milo, that was the speaker's name, the students that invited the speaker to campus, the faculty, the student body, what if we host that conversation a week with the goal simply being campus healing? Now, Manu, you're telling me a week after the largest protest in UC Berkeley's history, you're going to host a civic dialogue Go back to being a pre-med student. A week later, we hosted that first conversation. We called it Bridge Berkeley. About 75 people showed up, which for us was a big turnout. As I told the class earlier today, 35 of them left in the first 10 minutes because they thought it was a civic architecture frat. So we started wrestling with that conversation. We hosted a second one the next week. And that conversation, the 75 minutes of that conversation changed the trajectory of my life. What happened in that conversation? We had a room of people that were on their knife's edge, that felt like the people that were in that room were threatening their very existence. Seated, confused as to what's going to happen, nervous, and listening and ready to have the conversation. Now, if you try to get a bunch of people, and I know some of the amazing students here have facilitated some great dialogues, if you get a bunch of people into a room to host a conversation like that, chances are it's not going to go very well. So what did we do? One of my great friends who you saw in that video, Ross Irwin, who's one of my best friends and is the CEO of BridgeUSA, had an idea. He said, forget policy. Forget listening to each other and talking about free speech laws or bright lines in the sand or students. Let's just talk about vulnerability. Let's show up in this space as human beings. You know, the rest of our identity that is more than our politics, right? Let's show up and talk to each other about where our family's from, what brings you here, what's your story, what drives you, what's your purpose, what's the name of your mom? And those next 75 minutes transformed and gave me the understanding that at this moment in our society, we radically overestimate how divided we are, and we radically underestimate the power of a conversation. That's what that moment showed me. So now that I've established a little bit of how I got here, what were some of the things that motivated us to build that initial tiny little student club, I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes critiquing civic dialogue. Why? Why am I going to spend the next 10 minutes addressing the most powerful critiques against civic dialogue at this moment? It's because I think that we have to figure out a way to get people in our generation to recognize that if we cannot talk to people that are different than ourselves, there's no way this democratic experiment succeeds. What are the three biggest critiques that we've seen on college campuses across the country around civic dialogue? I'm sure you've heard a lot of them. I'm sure you're thinking a lot of them. I'm sure you're listening to me saying, who's this random guy talking to me about civic dialogue? When I've got a paycheck, I got to take care of things, I got to deal with my family, I got to address the different issues in my life and my society. What are some of the biggest critiques against civic dialogue? The first is that I think many of us at this moment in our society do not believe that having a conversation with somebody that we disagree with will actually move the needle on some of the most divisive issues in our moment. In 3 weeks, there's going to be an election. Man, I'm sorry you live in Pennsylvania. God, yesterday I was watching the NFL. Every 10 minutes, Kamala ad, Trump ad, Kamala ad, Trump ad. I'm like, does this thing even work? So I was listening and sitting there, right? And we have active college chapters across the country. We're in about 75 colleges, 40 high schools. We've got about 11,000 students across the country. As I was telling Ben and some of the other students in the reception just before this, people are jumping out of the woodworks when I have these conversations, which was not the case back in 2017. And the key question comes up, how can you actually talk about some of these most divisive issues? I'm going to tell you a story. It happened at Gettysburg College last July. July 23rd, 2023. We're at an event hosted by a partner organization called Braver Angels, and we're hosting a debate. Debate topic was, is the United States the greatest country in the world? Way to bridge a divide. Is the United States the greatest country in the world? This debate gets going. Different community members are there. This is not one of those things where all the argument nerds like me show up. This is one of those conversations that welcomes everybody in the community, right? We start hosting this conversation. About 45 minutes into this conversation, a white woman stands up. She says, I believe, with tears in her eyes, The United States is the greatest country in the world because my grandfather fought in World War II, fought evil against the Nazis. My uncle fought in Vietnam. My son is a Gold Star injured son in the global war on terror. How dare you even ask this question? My hand started shaking. I should have gone to pre-med. 2 speakers later, this African-American gentleman stands up in his 40s. He owned a barbershop in Philadelphia. That's where I was yesterday. And he looks her right in the eyes. He says, while your grandparents were fighting the Nazis in Europe, my grandparents couldn't drink out of the same water fountain. Talk about some of the most divisive issues in our country. Debate continues. We go into the reflection period. Go into the reflection period, where you have an example of one of the most divisive central questions about the identity, direction, future of this country. Go into the reflections. This white woman stands up, and she looks this man right in the eyes and says, I still believe that this is the greatest country in the world, but I want to apologize to you about the sins of my grandparents. Immediately, the African-American gentleman stands up, and he looks her back in the eyes, because he felt deep guilt from her. And he says, the fact that we live in a society where you and I can have an open conversation about each other's identities has shown me today that this is the greatest country in the world. Now, the point of that story is not about whether or not the United States is the greatest country in the world. Don't think about the trees through the forest. Don't lose sight of the greater picture. I wish some of your friends and your colleagues that are currently talking about demonstration policies are able to come to this event. And the reason being is because I think that we've built a societal infrastructure, especially in our generation, where we have completely given up on each other's humanity. Let me tell you something, y'all. I'm one of those weird, crazy people that goes on very long road trips. And one of those long road trips was from Austin to Boston. Austin's the middle of the country. Boston's where my family lives. Whenever I bring that up, somebody thinks it's like a bar and a rap song. Austin to Boston. Drove from Austin, Texas, to Shreveport, Louisiana, to New Orleans, Louisiana, through Selma, Alabama, Georgia, up through South Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, go to Washington, D.C., end up in Boston. You'll talk to people in the most liberal parts of Austin, Texas, that have extraordinarily defined and understood identities about the people that they think they fundamentally disagree with. You go to the most rural parts of Louisiana, and you'll have people saying, I have certain views and ideas about those folks. And you ask them, when was the last time you met somebody from either of these places? Never. This drive between Philadelphia to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. How many times have folks actually had a conversation with someone that they've seen on social media as a caricature of the identity that they think they're criticizing? Why is that? Point number 2. We live at a moment where outrage sells and nuance does not. In Dr. Leip's class, we brought up the concept of the number 10. Now, if you're sitting here and you hear something that I said and you said, I'm critical of that, I want you to ask a question, because the point of a bridge dialogue is let's hear each other, let's talk to each other, and let's engage and let's push back. So I want to tell you about the number 10. Outrage sells, nuance doesn't. What do I mean by that? I asked the class earlier today, what's the percentage of the primary voters that show up and vote in a primary election? in the electorate? Does anybody know? How much percentage of an electorate shows up in a primary election? You were in class. What's up? Tell me what you got. 10%. 10%. That means that 10% of people determine your general election candidates. Who are those 10% of people? They're probably the folks that are the most ideologically rigid. They're probably the folks that have the deepest beliefs, which is a good thing. They're probably the folks that want to have and show up and want to see their policy preferences heard. Right? So they are determining and filtering who you and I get to vote for in the general election. Let's take social media as an example. I'm not going to ask this question because you already know the answer. There's 150 million users on X. There did a study that showed that of the 150 million users, do you know how much of the content is actually user-generated content? Who actually posts? 10% of all users on Twitter actually drive the conversation. 15 million accounts make up 85% of the content that's posted online on X. 10%. If you're an influencer, if you're running for office, if you're a young person showing up to college campus, you're looking to make friends, you're looking to make an impact, the way of outrage gets us influence, traction, money. The way of nuance, no one's got time for that. How many times have we been on social media and we see that what I call the outrage industrial complex is driving the conversation? So outrage sells and nuance doesn't. And what's point number 3? Point number 3 is, well, the only people that have these civic dialogues are a bunch of moderates, a bunch of centrists. Who's heard that before? Who's thinking that about me right now? There you go. I see you. The title of this lecture is A New Divide. A New Divide. The video that you saw was from an annual BridgeUSA summit that we host every year where we bring all of our students together, all the young people doing this really good work, people from our generation, all across these campuses. And they're showing up, and they're thinking, they're having the conversation, and they come from the widest ideological spectrum, from the farthest to the left to the farthest to the right. They all disagree on the what. But you know what they agree on? They agree on the how. They believe that at this time, to show up to a conversation, to be open-minded versus closed-minded. They believe in this idea of being tolerant to people that are different than us, not to give them a pass, but to be able to listen, as opposed to being intolerant to the views that most conjecture against us. They believe in this notion that listening to people we disagree with is perhaps at this moment one of the most important and essential ways to reach people that are fundamentally opposed to us. They believe in this idea that creating spaces that bring more voices in are more effective than creating spaces that push people out. That's what they believe. I'm going to say something incredibly naive that I don't think is going to go over well. But I don't know. I think that the real divide right now is not necessarily a divide between Republicans and Democrats. I think the real divide is a divide between people that are open-minded and closed-minded. I think the real divide in our country is a divide between people that believe in a zero-sum world where they win at the expense of the other side, and people that understand that the way forward at this moment is to listen to people that we most disagree with. Now you're like, man, how does that contend with some of the most contentious issues of our time? Of course we're divided. What is this Republican, Democrat? You're telling me that 3 weeks from one of the most contentious, if not most consequential elections in the history of this country, you're telling me that we're not actually divided? Of course we're divided. Do you think that in the 60s people were not debating abortion policy with the same vigor? Do we really think that? I think what's changed is not our divisions. I think what's changed is how we engage people that are different than us. I think the problem in this country is not disagreement, it's how we have our disagreement. I think the problem in this country at this moment is that we have so given up on each other's ability to be redeemable that we've overwritten and underwritten this notion that people that are fundamentally different than us have no chance of revival. I asked a question earlier today, and Supa, thank you for organizing this amazing event. I had a conversation, we had a great interview conversation. And one of the questions that I'm curious about always when I come to a college campus or a high school, I work on college campuses a lot. I mean, I only graduated like 3 years ago, is that I feel, and I want to share this idea with you, I feel like the real problem in college campuses right now is not division. I think it's a culture of fear. And not in some conservative way or some liberal way. I think that most of us walk around campus just scared to say what's on our mind. I think most of us are nervous about potentially saying something, not because we're going to say something crazy, but because we just don't want to offend our fellow student, which makes a ton of sense. It's important. It's necessary. But as I gave the metaphor earlier in the class today, I think that oftentimes when folks hear me talk about this issue, they think that what Manu is really saying is that protest is bad and dialogue is good. How many folks think that that's the argument I'm making? A lot of people think that. The real argument I'm making is that it's not a question of what is more important. It's a question of what is most needed now. What is most needed now? Earlier in January, our organization, along with a bunch of different amazing organizations, organized a trip to the Middle East after the October 7th conflict. My colleague, Emily Green, who leads our high school work, a great friend of mine, went there and sat with and listened to people on both sides of that conflict. And you know what was so tragic about all those conversations? What was tragic about all those conversations is that back home here in the United States, when we talk about showing up and engaging, I think that when you ask the average American, what does it mean to you when you think about the word change? What comes to you? What comes to us is a closed fist. That's the symbol of change. You know what doesn't come to folks? Is an open palm. The three most effective social change makers in the 20th century, from Mahatma Gandhi to Dr. Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela, all recognized that change is a puzzle. And change is a puzzle where you got different skill sets, different tools for different moments. You got the knife in your culinary drawer. That's activism. You got the fork in your culinary drawer. That's having a dialogue. You got the spoon in your culinary drawer. That's having an active listening conversation. Now imagine I asked you, tell me, which one is the most important? You'd probably say it depends on the circumstance. Am I eating steak? Am I a vegetarian like Manu? Am I only eating salads? I'm a vegetarian, but I hate vegetables, so it puts me in a tough position. No, I think what you would probably say is, tell me the context. I think we need a little bit of all. Here's the fundamental argument I would posit, and we'll open this up into question in about 2 minutes. The fundamental argument that I would posit is that I think at this time in our American moment, where I think what guides most people is a sense of fear, it's a sense of alienation, it's a sense of loneliness. I think oftentimes a lot of people feel disconnected from each other. I think people think they know what other people think, but they don't really know. I think the mode of change that works in that moment is not the closed fist, but the open hand. The reason why I shared that story with you in Gettysburg, and I was honestly nervous about it, I didn't know if that story made sense at that moment, was because I want to start radically challenging what we think is possible at this moment. What BridgeUSA has done, what these college students have done across the country is, I think they're showing our political leaders, I think they're showing our administrators, but most importantly, they're showing ourselves that our generation at this time that has grown up in incredibly turbulent times, someone like me, I'm probably about 2 to 3 years older than I think the average age here. I was born 3 years before 9/11. I graduated middle school in the financial recession. I graduated high school in the 2016 election. Graduated college in 2020, the pandemic. Not a great sample size of democracy and boundless progress. I mean, someone like you and I have the ultimate right to say, screw it. But here's the thing. One of my most fascinating mentors is the first white secretary for Dr. Martin Luther King. He was actually a young man sleeping on the hotel room the night that Dr. King was practicing his March on Washington speech. And he had this fascinating insight to me that then our students have started to refine and talk about a little bit more. And the fascinating insight he had was that the United States in 2026 is going to be 250 years old. 250 years old. I heard that, I was like, man, that's old. 250 years? The Roman Empire lasts for 1,800 years. Chinese dynasties last for 1,500 years. Athenian democracy lasts for 400 years. The United States is not at the end of its story, it's in chapter 2 or 3. By 2045, the United States is going to be the most diverse democracy in the history of democracies. It's going to be a majority-minority country. If you study humanity at all, our nature, it's one of conflict, it's one of violence, it's one of tribalism. It's one of meeting people that are different than us, not with words, but with the spear. Not with an open hand, but a closed fist. The United States, my friends, especially those of us that are my age, we are embarked on an experiment that is not the greatest, it's not the worst, it's the most ambitious. It has never happened before. This notion, imagine I told you that there was a country out there, a civilization out there, 330 million people, all of whom look differently than each other, with different ideas, different backgrounds, heavily armed, trying to make it work. I believe that civic dialogue, talking to people that are different than us, is the most important skill in the 21st century. With some of the most disruptive technologies coming our way, with influencers trying to peddle outrage, with people trying to play on our skepticism, and frankly, people playing on our ability to turn against each other as opposed to turn towards each other. I don't think there's ever been a more important time for you to lead, not with the closed fist, but the open hand. Thank you for your time. I know how valuable it is.
So it is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, we ask that you raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before you ask your question. We reserve the first questions for students, but after that we open up to the rest of the audience. And with that, we are now looking for our first question.
Surely I'd said something that ruffled somebody.
Hi.
Hi, what was your name?
Sage.
Sage, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How do you create a space to have a civic dialogue with people who you might not classify as being open to having a civic dialogue?
Yeah, and I'll actually extend your question even further a little bit, which is, how do you have a conversation with someone that fundamentally denies your existence? Because that's where that question really goes. I promise you one thing at the start of this, which is that I will not leave here without addressing the biggest elephants in the room, because I feel the skepticism. So how do you handle that? I think there's two tiers to this. And let me be honest with you. I spent the first 4 years of this work organizing these dialogues, organizing these conversations, being called every word in the book there is to be called, from a fascist to a neo-Nazi to a dirty liberal to a dirty conservative. I'm like, guys, figure out your labels, jeez. At least be consistent with what you're going to call me. Again, my intention was pure. I was genuinely concerned for my fellow students. So 2 levels. The first level is, how do you actually set up the space? I think that some of the work that some of your amazing faculty directors are doing, some of your fellow students are doing, is right on, which is you have to be clear in your expectations. We often approach these conversations with people, and we assume that success means we're going to win the argument. That I'm going to show up and I'm going to win this argument. Sorry to tell you, you're going to be let down 100% of the time. Because I think the real goal ought to be, I'm going to show up in this space to understand why the other person disagrees with me. If I can leave this conversation with a better understanding of what about their experience causes them to believe on a policy level, we're not getting to the existence questions yet. We're getting simply to just policy questions, basic divisions. If I can leave this conversation knowing, and your name was Sarah? Sage. If I can leave this conversation knowing, Sage's background is the reason why Sage may think this about this issue, I think I've won. Because I think that I have a better understanding of somebody else that might disagree with me. So I think that's step number 1. Step number 2 is, I don't think you can have the conversation until you clearly set expectations. Are we both here with an open mind, with the goal being not to win my argument, but to understand? The reason why BridgeUSA chapters have, honestly, to my surprise, grown like crazy is because I think that people in our generation are craving a space that's judgment-free and built for connection. And so what happens is everybody that's showing up in a bridge space has a shared set of norms. Think about it like this way. If I walked into this auditorium and everybody had no shoes, I'd probably take my shoes off. Because that's just how humans work. If you show up in a bridge conversation and everyone there, 1, you realize is pretty diverse, 2, you realize is pretty ideologically diverse, and 3, you realize everybody's got open hands here. Suddenly what happens, I think, Sage, is that even the people that are the most divisive are willing to at least listen. So that's the first part. The second part is the existence question, which you haven't asked, but I want to address. As I was sharing with the class earlier today, one of our student leaders at the George Washington chapter had a fascinating insight. It's about a year ago. She said, I hear you on the answers to that question, but I think we have to ask a different question. I think we got to answer that question with a question. I said, that feels a little dodgy, but tell me your answer. She said, what happens if we don't? How do I have a conversation with somebody that fundamentally denies my experience? And she said, what happens if I don't? Just going to let that hang there for a second. And here's part 3, which is, I think this is the role of allies. It's the role of allies. Here's what I mean by that. I am not asking what you might define as the oppressed category to have a conversation, but I'm certainly not giving myself a pass. Because we're trying something awesome here. We're trying something awesome. I didn't say greatest, I didn't say worst, awesome. It's this idea that people of all backgrounds are going to try to govern together. It sends chills down my body every time I think about it, because I grew up for the first 5 years with my grandparents in a village in India, and I'm not talking the Pennsylvania villages. And I spent time with them. And when my grandfather passed away 2 years ago, and I hear him talk about how people in his country and his land treat difference, I know that we're going to get it wrong. Of course we're going to get it wrong. That's just not how we're built. That's why outrage sells, because we love outrage. That's easy. Does that help your question? Uh-oh, y'all are going to get your exercise in. Oh, and he's a Phillies fan. It's all right. Some divides are not meant to be bridged.
Yeah, right?
And what was your name?
So my name is Gabe.
Gabe. Nice to meet you, Gabe.
And my number one thought comes down to, as you were saying, kind of like when discussing your opinion, there is a lot of fear that tends to come with that, of fear of being isolated amongst other people. And I feel like especially in an environment where people will say that they are open-minded and are willing to hear you out, yet when they do hear your opinions and they don't relate to you, they tend to just hear what you're saying and not listen to what you're saying.
Yes.
So my question is how do I express my opinion in a way where I won't feel like I'm being isolated from my opinion in an environment where people might not want to listen to what I'm saying?
And can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Which is, could you give me an example of a context that you're talking about?
Sure. So I feel like, especially at Dickinson, there is a heavy emphasis on, especially with the two political parties here, there's a heavy emphasis on a lot of democratic beliefs here. And I feel like with my opinions, I tend to lean towards democratic beliefs.
Sure.
Yet I also feel like there are some Republican beliefs that I tend to agree with. Yet I feel like while being here, even though people will say they're willing and open-minded to hear me out, they hear what I have to say and then just go, I don't agree with that. That's not what I wanted to hear. So I'm not going to listen. Yep.
I'm preventing myself from asking more questions because, as Dr. Labe knows, I ask a bunch of follow-up questions. And actually, right after this conversation, we're going to host a quick, 20-person dialogue, and you're welcome to join, where I would love that conversation to be a back and forth, just more casual conversation about some of this stuff, because I want to hear from you what's on your mind and what you're thinking about. So here's the deal, which is that I think what we have to realize are two things. The first is that it's very difficult, I think, at this moment to talk in the terms of feelings. What I mean by that is what I hear you saying was, I feel like certain people are not willing to listen, right? Or I feel like certain people are not able to engage. And the problem in our democracy is that I think people have very set conceptions of here's what it means to be oppressed in our country, here's what it means to be an oppressor in our country, and that there can't be any cross-pollination. So what I mean by that is oftentimes people posit their identities are static, right? And there's a lot of truth to that. There is a lot of truth to that. There's a historical analysis that's required as it relates to truth, as it relates to those identities. But I think that if we don't make the attempt in our one-on-one conversations, norm number 2 of a bridge discussion is listen to listen rather than to respond. That if we don't show up with the attitude of listening, I don't think we get anywhere. Here's the funny thing. We get so wrapped up in our 35-minute argument, right, or our Twitter battle. The funniest thing in this is, you know who wins ultimately in the Twitter battle? It's not one of the people in that argument. It's Elon Musk. Because there's engagement. Me winning the argument against you, Gabe, right now, let's say we were talking about whether or not we should do land acknowledgements. Me and you having that disagreement and me trying to prove to you that I'm right is not going to change anything. But what I think will change is if I show up in that conversation wanting to know, well, here's why Gabe thinks what he thinks. I think that we've built a culture where it's talk first, think second. And frankly, I think that our generation's been set up to fail in the way that social media is operated. Because what social media has incentivized us, and as I told the class last week, we work with a lot of these companies in different settings to think through and advise and engage. What it's done is it's caused us to operate in a model where the way you gain traction, the way you gain friends, the way you speak out is through adversarial conflict. And then we want to start reversing that a little bit. And what I found in these bridge discussions, some of the structured dialogue sessions that folks host, is that if you build a norm where people feel relatively safe, relatively open to hearing, and relatively engaged, you'll be shocked. The most life-filling experiences I have is those reflections after those debates, like that reflection story that I told you about, because it's like literal nectar at this moment. I feel like the American public at this time is like that lone traveler in the middle of a desert, just waiting for the oasis. Because all you see in our media is we cannot resolve any of our conflicts. And the sad thing in that moment, again, we host a weekly podcast game every Monday where we'll interview different presidential candidates, different intellectual leaders. And what's so clear is that what's out there is theater. And they know that they can play us. And the moment you realize that you're being played in their outrage politics, suddenly you have the opportunity to unplug. And I think if you unplug, you disincentivize outrage and you incentivize conversation. And now I know I'm going off your question, but I'll tell you a funny story. 2 weeks ago, I was on the Hill, and I had one of the most frustrating conversations with a member of Congress. This member of Congress said, "I'm not a leader, I just follow." Now, who do you follow? The people. I said, okay, so you follow the people. Okay, tell me more. Because the context of that conversation was I wanted them to tell me about how we can reduce polarization at the congressional level. And he said, well, the people act this way. They want conflict. I just do what the people say. The sad reality is that our leaders are like weather vanes. They just follow the loudest voices. And the problem right now is that the loudest voices in our society believe that the only way to create change is the knife. And my argument to you and my contention to you as you leave this conversation is, let's try to pick up the fork and the spoon. Let's give it a shot. I think there's a couple questions right over there. Or you got a question? Yeah, sorry, you all decide. Y'all decide.
Firstly, thank you for your presentation. I think you're a phenomenal speaker, and I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you tonight.
Thank you for listening.
And my question is more so, it comes from like a trend that I've seen, I guess, since I reached the age of consciousness, and I've kind of like noticed politics around me.
Okay.
It's the sense that people fight passionately and with anger because they feel that if they do not win, then they're forgotten. And so I mean, that's also what we've seen in politics thus far. It's generally two sides which hold a certain set of beliefs, and the person who wins kind of expresses those beliefs in public. And so I guess my question regards, in a country that you described as being in its adolescence, do you believe that it's possible for us to not only engage in open conversation, but to integrate the fundamental differences we have between us into our school systems, into our political system, into these open conversations that we have? Do you think we can do more than simply speak, but also accommodate differences that we cannot, find middle ground in, but still, be open to the idea of, maintaining that polarity?
And what was your name?
Fatima.
Huh?
Fatima.
Nice to meet you. So, Kevin, can I walk around? Cool. So, there's three things I would think about. The first thing that I would think about is that if we don't figure out how to integrate our differences, this experiment is going nowhere. If you were a betting person and you lived on Mars and I told you about the American experiment, you would bet against it every time. And I think that oftentimes when we show up to a college campus or a high school, and when our students are advocating, they're hosting these tables, they're hosting middle ground conversations, they're hosting listening sessions, listening tables, dialogues, we've started telling people to flip the script. Too many times the people that talk about listening are oftentimes on the defense. Because the offensive arguments are, we got to create change, we got to get progress. Yes, all that is important, but my argument is that we, I think, give up on the most ambitious idea of America if we lose the ability to have that conversation. The second thing I would say is that when we use the phrase integrating difference, and I remember, I think it was Laura in the pre-reception, had this interesting study from this organization called PACE, right? Where that organization surveyed and showed that different words have different partisan rings. So part of the challenge with when we say the phrase something like integrated differences is that to everybody it means something different. So when I'm talking to, let's say, a certain group of people, they'll hear integrating difference and they'll think I'm talking about DEI. When I'm talking to a different audience of people and they hear integrating difference, they think I'm talking about free speech. And the problem is that we're so quick to politicize and judge, or you're so quick to try to figure out, is Manu a Republican or a Democrat? That we forget the bigger picture. I'm sure somebody's already trying to figure that out. Secret, I don't know. I don't know how you just know that you're born a Democrat or Republican. I don't know how that works. And point number 3, to your really good question, is when we approach integrating differences in the classroom, and we're having this conversation in the pre-reception, I think we have to figure out how do we balance the framework of diversity, equity, and inclusion, a power analysis, which is important, with the fact that if we don't create a space where people of different viewpoints can have a conversation, we don't have a democracy. How do you reconcile those two things? And importantly, I don't think they should be in tension. Because everything's a freaking tension these days. Every issue's got to be yes or no. Every influencer you listen to has got to say yes or no. And you know what's really sad is I know the version of the speech I got to give you today to get a big applause. Because this is theater. And the leaders out there know how to play on your instincts. And my job and my argument is let's try to be independent thinkers, not because that's what the right says or that's what the left says, because it's good for us. Does that help?
All right, we have time for one more question.
Can we take both of them? Is that all right? Or are we?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Somya. And
Sonia?
Somya.
Somya, nice to meet you, Somya.
So I've heard, especially with the classes that I take that are kind of centered around politics or policies, I've heard from my professors that to facilitate like meaningful dialogue, you have to attack the idea, not the person. But I've also heard that your political ideologies also make a part of your identity. So I'm just like really torn between those two kind of sides of the argument, and I don't know how to approach it. So how would you approach it?
I would approach it by asking what the goal of the conversation is. I think that if you asked, well, it's not even a rhetorical question. I do ask random people, which is sometimes a weird thing to do, but like I'll be sitting on the flight and I'll ask like, so what do you think about talking to somebody you disagree with? Don't worry, there's like context there. I'm just randomly approach somebody and be like, what do you think? And in that context, in that conversation, one of the interesting things is that people's conception of what a dialogue is immediately goes to the most extreme thing. So what they think when I hear, let's have a conversation on something we disagree with, they immediately think abortion. They immediately think gun control. They immediately think free speech. They immediately think Israel-Palestine. And yes, each of those issues are important. Yes, they're very important parts of our identities and who we are. But there's also 97 other issues that are going pretty well, which is why they never come up. And so my first point would be, let's start with some of those issues where we can break bread a little bit and have that conversation. Let's just start exercising the skill. Like, let's not jump into the Elon-Mark Cuban brawl, right? Like, let's jump into, we're just going to have a conversation about what we thought about as it relates to the commencement speaker last year. Let's, like, have that conversation. And the second thing I would just say is that when we think about our identity being tied to our policy, that's always been the case, and unfortunately and fortunately, it will always be the case. Part of the reason why I love this work, why I will always stand here and talk about it and listen to it and hear you engage, is because it's a part of my identity, right? Like, one of our visions is to as a lot of my really good activist friends say, for them, activism is a part of their identity. For others, being a basketball player is a part of their identity. I think one of the parts of our identities have to be a bridge builder. Like, I'm a bridge builder because this American experiment requires me to be one. And so part of the fact is, and the unsatisfying answer there, is that that will always be the case. But if we set expectations, we set guardrails, we set boundaries, we can start to make it so that we're comfortable in that discomfort. And that last question, I know we're pushing time. I'll try to be really brief.
Feel free to clarify if I'm misinterpreting
Please.
anything.
And what was your name?
Do you want the truth or the lie?
Nice to meet you.
Okay, nice to meet you too. What was that question? Oh, it seems as though, from what I'm interpreting, if you're bringing up like quadriloop learning with the focus of intentionality, and if I was to create like a force field analysis, which is based off community psych, which is looking at things that are both pushing back but also pushing things forward, because of this emphasis on intentionality and understanding of those that are engaging within that space, I'm curious to see if maybe you've had any threat modeling as to maybe what is pushing things back. You bring up a collegiate approach, which is like what the student population or even just like faculty and members are bringing into the space, but I was wondering what else do you believe is pushing back beyond maybe just ourselves?
Mm-hmm. If we were in a different setting, by the way, I'd ask you to rephrase your question. But what I hear you saying is, are there different systemic forces that are causing us to operate in this way that are beyond just ourselves? Because I think what you're articulating is that I've essentially posited a worldview in which the individual is what matters the most. Is that correct? Can you rephrase your question?
No, you're good. More along the lines of, it seems as though what I'm interpreting from what you're saying is you want us to understand more of one another, and not necessarily just the individual level, but simply just an understanding each other as a whole.
Yeah, that's right. What's the question?
The question is, if you were to observe the threats that I guess were preventing this or maybe inhibiting it, I'd want to know what do you perceive those threats to be, and what do you believe has yet to be discussed?
Yeah, I think I would say the three threats that I'm currently seeing as it relates to our ability to actually listen and engage is, one, is the outrage industrial complex. How many folks have heard of the military-industrial complex as a phrase? You've probably never heard of the outrage industrial complex. I just made it up. The idea behind the outrage industrial complex is this notion that the fundamental currency in an attention economy is outrage. And I think that that systemic force causes us to inherently operate in an outrage model as opposed to being able to listen and engage. The second, I think, force that is particularly pervasive at this moment is that I think that our leaders and our different stakeholders, from members of Congress to social media influencers to civic council leaders, I think they realize that it's much easier to run on a problem than to fix a problem. As a result, every conversation becomes one where I don't tell you about how I'm going to fix this problem, but I'm going to tell you why the other person's evil. I think the problem in that model, even if you believe the other person's evil, is that I think we're shortchanging ourselves. We deserve a world in which our leaders are incentivized to solve our problems, but not traffic on each other's outrage. I think we deserve that world. And then the final thing that I would say, and I'll close with this, and I really appreciate everybody sticking on time, but I think I feel folks listening. And I hope that was success today. Is that I think that right now on our college campuses, one of the things that we have to recognize is that there is no other space, in my view, that has the potential to lay the seeds for us to actually have these conversations than the college campus. This, y'all, is easy. This is easy. This is really safe. This is really productive. What's hard is when we graduate school and realize that very quickly what wins out there is our inability to listen to each other. We have an opportunity to be in an environment with people that are very different than us and to learn with them, to hear them, to engage them. If I told my grandfather 2 years ago, before he'd passed away, that I would be trying to make the argument in the United States that this notion of being on a college campus where you can listen, engage, and hear each other is a privilege, he would have rolled over. So that's what I would posit, is that there are real challenges in the world. There are real differences. There's real ideological gaps. We're not going to be able to fix it all. We're probably not going to get close. But my argument is that we're not even trying. And here's the secret. I think most people want to try. I think most people on campus want to have the conversation. I think most people in our communities want to listen to each other. The problem in our country right now is not a problem of polarization, division, but is a problem that the loudest voices have dominated the microphone at the expense of the rest of us. Thank you, everybody.
That is